Hello, today I'm reviewing the Eclipse, the brand new control pad from Odin Gaming. This is a completely unique surface that aims to go beyond imitation to become the ultimate control pad. Well, as per their marketing, of course. That means that this is a slow, smooth, uncoated cloth pad that feels very controlled but still avoids feeling muddy so you can still use it for faster paced games. And while I don't think it quite lives up to this ultimate control pad name they have given it, I have certainly enjoyed my time using the surface. I had pretty low expectations going into this, honestly. I thought it would be pretty generic, but I was very pleasantly surprised. Odin was able to develop a legitimately good surface. And now this is of course inspired by the Artisan Zero, they've made that extremely obvious. But I certainly think that this pad does its own thing and carves its own niche in the market. So later I will compare these two pads, and explain why I don't even think that they are direct competitors, but are still each good in their own regard. Overall, I think this is actually a great slow control pad. I don't think it's quite going to be for everybody though. So today I want to go over the surface in depth, and try to help you guys understand if this pad is going to be right for you. Alright, let's get into it. Right off the bat, this pad feels good for $30. This surface itself is high quality and feels like premium, very nice fabric. It seems durable and really built to last. The stitching as well is also pretty decent. It is raised above the surface, and you can certainly feel the height difference, especially in these vertical motions. The actual threads used in the stitching themselves though are pretty soft, so it doesn't feel irritating whatsoever when you're moving your arm across the stitching. The only thing that you really notice is this very obvious height difference. I was eventually able to get used to this, but it did take me a couple days. I have been very spoiled by good stitching, and this is definitely a step down from the better options. I would certainly love to see an edge that is more flush with the surface, but this is by far not the worst stitch edging I've ever used. It is very usable if you can get used to the height difference. Now the non-stick backing is something that really excels on this pad. It is of course just the natural classic rubber base, nothing fancy here. If you have ever used a gaming mousepad before, you've probably seen a base just like this. However, this is still by far the best implementation of this natural rubber base I've ever tried. I can still pretty easily move the pad around my desk if I wanted to. But the moment I apply any sort of downward pressure, this doesn't move whatsoever. This pad goes far beyond what I ever would have expected from a natural rubber base. It feels really good. It does not move at all when I'm playing. The pad is also laid completely flat. However, it wasn't like this right out of the box. When I first had it down on my desk, this entire side of the surface was crinkled. This is because the pad is so floppy that when it was rolled up in the box, it didn't actually get a clean roll, and instead got folded and creased at some points. This creasing was very visible on the first day, and I could even feel it while moving my mouse across the surface. I was able to remove these creases by placing my SkyPad upside down on top of the surface overnight, so it was still fixable for me. But I think that a lot of people, this may actually be a more severe issue. If your pad got even more crinkled than mine during shipping, then your pad might end up being actually damaged. But I think most people will be able to remove these crinkles. So overall the quality on this pad is pretty solid, but it still isn't anything revolutionary. It is better than what I would have expected from $30, but it still doesn't come close to competing with Artisans or other high quality premium options. The potential crinkling is really my only major issue on an otherwise solid high quality pad. Alright, now onto the surface feel, or what this actually feels like to game on. Firstly, the surface is super soft and slightly fuzzy. I think pretty easily that this surface has the softest, most pleasant arm feel on anything I've ever tried. It feels really good. I cannot overstate that. It feels like a soft blanket. It is just so good. This softness of the surface also translates to your mouse feet and creates a very smooth, extremely premium feeling glide. Just like with the arm feel, this is also the smoothest glide I've ever experienced on a control pad. It is absolute butter and is extremely satisfying. And also all while without being coated, mind you. All the smoothness you're getting is just from how the actual surface itself is designed. The pad also has just a very slight amount of give to it. It isn't quite as soft and squishy like an Artisan Soft or the X10, but you will still notice this feeling more plush than other typical cloth pad offerings. I don't really feel like my hand ends up sinking into the pad and adding more comfort. Instead, I feel like the slight amount of plushiness just ends up absorbing some shock and adding a little bit of cushioning. Whenever I'm resetting my mouse or just moving my hand around, it just feels very pleasant, and contributes to the surface feeling more comfortable. If you ever have concerns with squishiness, then I don't think this will be an issue for you. It still feels pretty firm, just has a tiny bit of give. Large dynamic motions have a very noticeable amount of friction and feel very controlled. For example, even though the surface feels very soft, if I rub my finger up against it, I can very easily feel the heat building up even though it's so smooth. This high friction gives a very noticeable tug whenever you're moving your mouse, and makes the pad overall feel fairly slow. However, because it is so smooth, it doesn't actually feel as slow as it can be. The surface will certainly feel quicker than something like a G-SR or an Equate, and that is due to how smooth these dynamic motions feel. You also get a fantastic feeling of stopping power due to this high friction. I feel like if I press down on the pad at all, I get a very sure, very stable stop right at the end of a flick. You are missing a little bit of a rough texture that can help add a little bit of feeling of stopping power, but this pad applies so much friction that you don't really need that. You can still very easily get a stable stop on such a smooth surface. It really has that feeling where all you really need to do is just let your mouse go and it just comes to a stop for you. It feels like it helps you out so much. And while I did say that it does lack the roughness to add some extra stopping power, this surface does actually feel very slightly textured when you're making these large movements. This is because the weave itself is actually pretty loose and there are little tiny gaps. You can pretty easily feel these gaps on the leading edges of your skates, and they will add a tiny bit of texture when you're making these large swipes. It is still not nearly as much as a genuinely textured surface though, and this glide is certainly smoothness first. This tiny texture is just more of a bonus to help the glide feel more satisfying. Now, what really makes this pad feel so slow and controlled is that it has a very high amount of static friction. On all these small movements that you make, you will feel a very noticeably high amount of friction, much more than the dynamic ones. And this can actually make the pad feel slower for you if you use a high sense and primarily use these very small inner hand motions to aim. It is seriously a big difference between how these motions feel and then the large ones I talked about previously. That is one of the things that defines how the surface feels. There is a very noticeable disconnect you get between how much friction you get on large and small motions. However, even though this pad does have a feeling of very high static friction, it doesn't quite feel sticky. It still feels very easy to quickly change directions when tracking, despite how slow and controlled this pad feels. You can also very quickly start a flick and get a very snappy feeling out of it. Many pads that are this slow are even slightly faster than this, end up feeling like they slow your aim down and add a delay because of how sticky they are from a standstill. It ends up feeling like you have to overcome the stickiness in order to get your mouse to move. Therefore, adds a slight delay to when you're reactively tracking and changing direction, or when you want to make a quick flick. But this pad, however, doesn't have that feeling of slowing down your aim whatsoever, and I feel like it still very quickly react and makes fast movements. However, you still will have to learn this feeling, and it won't come naturally. You still will have to apply a very large amount of force to change directions. It does not come free like a speed pad. But once you do learn the amount of force that you need to apply, it will feel very snappy, much more so than its speed would suggest. This feeling of comparatively high amount of snappiness for its speed is what makes this pad viable for faster paced games despite being so slow in my opinion. You can still play quickly on such a slow pad, but only when it doesn't add that sticky, muddy feeling, which this pad does not. This high friction also allows the pad to feel very locked in and highly stable. This locked in feeling makes microcorrections feel very deliberate and precise. Now finally, I will say that this pad is overall humidity resistant. It has been very cool and dry where I live since this pad was released, so I have not had the best conditions to test this, but I do sweat a lot, so I have been able to get the surface pretty moist. When that does happen, I do notice a little bit of swampiness get introduced. I almost feels like sweat kind of sticks to the very top layer of the surface, and makes it feel a little slicker in dynamic motions and a little bit stickier in static ones. However, this still isn't nearly as bad as a lot of the cloth pads I've used. The humidity resistance is much better than I expected, and if you aren't extremely sweaty like I am, I don't think you'll have any issues. Alright, so now on to my personal thoughts. Overall, this pad is solid for me. I enjoyed using it a lot and I performed pretty well on it. The most important thing for me about the surface is that it is the most comfortable pad I have ever used. The absolute only flaw I can find in this comfort is this raised stitching. But besides that, this actual surface feel on my arm is absolutely exquisite. Arm feel is something that is super important for me, so this alone will keep me coming back to the pad and enjoying it consistently. But even besides just how comfortable it is, I also performed decently. My click timing especially felt pretty consistent on the surface. I feel that the extra resistance I get on these static motions without feeling sticky allows me to be very precise. When I have to overcome so much resistance, I feel like it really forces me to slow down and make sure that the correction movements I make are the right ones. I don't really have any room for error when it's so hard to make these movements. I can't simply make a lazy correction and then recorrect it. I have to be on point with my very first motion. And I feel that a pad that forces me to do this helps me to be more consistent. However, this resistance does make these small motions pretty hard to make. I don't quite feel like I have the same level of pixel accuracy as I do on a faster pad. Therefore, I actually had to lower my sense to play on the surface. I couldn't roll with my usual sense because it was a little bit too difficult to make these smaller motions. But once I did drop it down by several centimeters, I did find that I could be more precise than usual. Just be aware that if you are someone that likes to make these very tiny movements, then this pad may be a little bit too slow for you. I really do feel that it's just so much more effortless to make small motions on a much faster pad, which is really the biggest downside of the Surface for me. I also felt that I could track very well on the Surface. Of course, this is probably just because I'm a little bit of a weirdo, because I think most people will find tracking on such a slow surface extremely uncomfortable. But for me personally, it felt great. I set multiple Kovacs records, and I felt very consistent with my tracking. I felt that it's still so easy to quickly change direction for reactive tracking, and the extra flicking helped make my smooth tracking very consistent and very locked in, and eliminated most of the jitters that I would normally get. I still do very much think that this is just a personal preference thing though, because I do have a very high tension to very stiff tracking style, and I feel that a slower pad helps smooth it out a little bit. I think for someone that's already very smooth and very calm when you track, I think a fast surface will do much better. But if you track like I do, where you're very tight and very stiff, then I think that a slow surface that doesn't feel sticky, just like this one, will absolutely work wonders for you and feel really good for tracking. Switching and acquiring targets also feels pretty snappy because how smooth the glide is and how much stopping power you have. Although it is still pretty difficult because of how slow the pad is. It did take me a little while to get used to acquiring a targets with a pad that is so much slower than what I'm used to using. But after about a week I felt pretty solid and I felt I was very snappy with it. A faster pad is still of course so much easier with this, and will ultimately feel much better. But I am still surprised how snappy I am with such a controlled surface. I am still really surprised how well I perform on the surface that is generally outside of my comfort zone. And there really is only one thing that holds the surface back from becoming a potential main for me. And that is that I really prefer something that is just a little bit easier to make micro adjustments with. I feel that this pad is just too slow on these small motions and I have to think about my aim far too much. There's so much resistance I have to be constantly aware on how much force I actually have to apply to my mouse in order to get it to move. On pads that are much faster with these motions but still feel controlled, like the Artisan Zero or especially the X10, I feel that my aim is so much more effortless and I don't really have to think about these corrections as much. With the Eclipse, I do feel I'm slightly more precise than those pads, but I do have to always think about my aim to achieve this. If I start to relax a little bit too much, I just get completely thrown off. If I'm not hyper vigilant about being aware of how much force I need to apply, I start to lose that feeling of great consistency and my entire reason to use this pad. So overall, I still will absolutely prefer something that are a little bit easier to make these corrections with. I'm always someone that values a pad that I don't have to think about, so this still isn't main potential for me personally. But if this high amount of resistance isn't something that bothers you, then I think this could be an absolutely phenomenal pad for you. Don't let my personal preferences get in the way of your enjoyment. If this doesn't bother you, this is an absolutely amazing pad. But still, regardless of this pad not being main potential, it will definitely be something that I will go back to and revisit from time to time. It just feels so good on my arm, and that feeling of precision is really nice. I feel that this pad ended up replacing my two previous top slow pad options, the extra pad Equate and Gamesense Radar. It feels like this pad offers an experience right in between those two and has everything that I would ever want out of a slow controlled pad. So this will be my go-to whenever I want a slow controlled surface in the future. Alright, so now onto some quick comparisons. The first one that Odin basically forced me to make is of course to the Zero Soft. As I said at the top of this video, I don't think that this is actually a very good direct comparison to make. While these pads do both have the same goal, of providing a very controlled feel that doesn't feel muddy at all and is still viable for faster paced games, I think this is where the comparison ends. Just like Odin has said, the Eclipse is only inspired by the Zero. It definitely does its own thing. The first and most obvious difference between these two is that the Zero is far more abrasive. This is of course an old Zero that I have had for a very long time, and I have heard that the newer Zero surfaces are a little bit smoother and less abrasive, but even these will be much more abrasive than the Eclipse. This extra abrasiveness on the Zero gives a far more textured glide on every single motion that you make. You will get much more feedback from the pad than you do on the Eclipse. The glide itself also feels noticeably faster overall, especially in the static friction where micro movements are so much easier to make on the Zero. The actual dynamic glide feels much closer though. Overall this makes the Zero feel a little bit more balanced. Because like I said with the Eclipse, it has a very high amount of static friction but a relatively quick dynamic friction. The Zero in comparison feels much closer between these two values, and overall feels like a slightly smoother transition between these small to large movements. The Zero also ends up feeling like it has slightly more stopping power, even though it probably doesn't compared to the Eclipse. This is because while the glide is quicker, it does have that extra little bit of texture that helps give you some extra stopping power without actually slowing it down whatsoever. The Zero therefore feels like it has a better ratio between glide speed to stopping power, which makes it feel a little bit more snappy. I really like that the Zero feels like this, and it is what made me fall in love with this pad. Adding just a little bit of abrasiveness to add some extra control without slowing the pad down is just objectively better than a smooth surface in my opinion. I still do really like how the Eclipse feels, but I don't think that you can beat the performance of a slightly more rough surface. And then of course to top it all off, Artisan is of course way higher quality. It is not even close. And honestly this isn't even really a knock on Odin. Nothing else can compete with Artisan. Saying that a pad is lower in quality than an FX Artisan is basically a non-statement. It is just implied. So overall, I still do definitely think that the Zero is a better surface. It feels higher performance because of its ratio to speed and stopping power. The actual quality is of course miles better. And I just personally like how the surface feels a little bit more because of how much easier the micro corrections are to make on this. I still certainly think that the Zero holds the title of the ultimate control pad. I don't think Odin has come close to usurping this. But if you want something much slower, smoother, and more controlled feeling, then the Eclipse is still a fantastic option. And definitely has forged an identity for itself outside of the Zero. Alright, so now onto what I think is a much better comparison to make. And that is to, of course, the Gamesense Radar. I think that these two pads are very similar. So much so that I actually thought the Eclipse was a clone of the Radar at first. As I was pulling the Eclipse out of the box, and I just felt the texture of the surface on my fingers, I was immediately able to identify that it felt almost exactly like the Gamesense Radar. And that honestly wasn't a bad thing for me, because this is a pad I like a lot. I got it on day one and have kept coming back to it. I like that it had locked in feeling glide, but it still wasn't sticky like the previous control pad offerings I felt, and I could still very quickly change direction and make snappy movements. With the Radar, I also liked that I could add a little bit of pressure to add some additional static friction and get a more locked in feeling. But once I got the Eclipse down on my desk, I figured out that it wasn't exactly a clone, and it is still different in some very key ways. First of all, the Eclipse is a little bit more fuzzy and overall has a softer texture. The actual weave patterns themselves are almost identical, and I would be willing to bet that they're exactly the same. It's just that the Eclipse uses a slightly softer material. This softer material is what creates the better arm feel and overall smoother glide. I already thought that the Gamesense Radar had a very smooth glide for a control pad, and the Eclipse just blows it out of the water. So one thing that I already liked about the Radar is just outright beaten by the Eclipse. And then next I noticed that the Eclipse has a very similar feeling of static friction as when I apply pressure to the Radar. That locked in feeling I get on the Eclipse is just there by default. And then I could even push in further on the Eclipse to get even more control. But while the static friction experience is pretty similar, I felt that the glide on the Gamesense Radar is still noticeably faster. Therefore, I felt that the Eclipse was much more balanced. And while I did like the Radar, my biggest issue with it was always that the difference between static and dynamic friction was a little bit too great to feel comfortable with. Sometimes the disparity between a medium speed glide and a very locked in feeling on small motions felt great. But other times the differences was just too much to handle and I felt very inconsistent on the surface. The Eclipse in comparison feels far more balanced and overall more neutral. There is still a large difference between static and dynamic motions on that pad, but it is not nearly as bad as the Radar. So it feels way more balanced in comparison. The more that I use the Eclipse, the more that I start to realize that it is just a better Radar for me personally. The Eclipse manages to take the Radar's already smooth glide and make it even smoother, and then also provides the same feeling of control without being sticky, while just adding even more control. And then on top of it, it is also more balanced between static and dynamic motions. Everything that I previously liked about the Radar is just done a little bit better by the Eclipse. I still do think that the Radar is a good option and a very solid control pad, because it will feel noticeably faster on these dynamic motions and when you don't apply any pressure into the surface. But if you want something that feels a little bit higher quality, more balanced, and more controlled, the Eclipse is a perfect option. It feels like such a natural transition from the Radar. Alright, so in conclusion, the Eclipse is an absolutely great slow control pad. It can offer you a similar locked-in experience as mud pads without any of the stickiness. I think it can work great for whatever you throw at it, if you can get used to the speed, of course. This pad is absolutely a great high-quality option for all you control lovers out there. If you want a slow pad, I think that this is the one to beat, and certainly gets my recommendation for this category. Thank you all for watching. See you in the next one.